Okay, well, welcome everyone. We'll get going. I thought I'd just put on a quick thing from your website that just explains who you are, Woody, for any new viewers here. So I've been probably listening and getting intelligence from Woody Brock. Oh my goodness, I think since 1991 at a very, very previous firm. And Woody, you've been great as ever. Just quickly here, you earned your BA, your MBA, and your MS, Master of Science from Harvard University, and your MA and PhD from Princeton University. And it's really your background's in mathematical economics and political philosophy. So those are two great areas to try to understand what's going on in the world right now, economically and politically speaking. So why don't I just quickly put up your points of discussion here, Woody, and then I'll toggle them off and on during your conversation, just trying to create some Q&A and some interaction. But you'll talk about the Trump presidency and some of the principal threats of that and the real significance of Trump's victory. And then, of course, the incredible concern, which every day seems to get worse, about potential World War III. So maybe with all of that, Woody, why don't you just take it away?
You're very kind. And the first thing I always do is to say what issues bother you a lot that I can answer up front. And if I don't know any answers, I'll be the first to say so. I mean, is there anything you're particularly worried about? It is, after all, Canada.
Can governments in this day and age get inflation under wraps without beating it over the head like Paul Volcker did? That'd be one question. Yeah, inflation's our biggest concern, and then tariffs and trade wars and all of those things. I'm sure you'll talk about, but every day they get more real, and it's the great unknown right now. And almost wish it was January 21st in 2025, and the market was already at it. But everybody's just guessing right now. So those are a couple areas.
I think that the first thing you should do is remember my view that analyzing the markets has really little to do with analyzing the economy these days. In other words, the markets are obsessed with the Fed. And 3 years ago, the Fed, as you know, steeply raised interest rates in a very short time by 530 basis points. You remember that huge rate because of the inflation that has surged. Everyone, including the Fed governors, assumed that would cause a recession of some magnitude. I dissented and wrote that there would be no recession at all. And the reasons for it I've been going over with you for 20 years, which is that the Fed, they can change the Fed funds rate. Well, that's fine, except that in a post-industrial service economy, no one gives a flying you-know-what about the Fed funds rate. It doesn't affect Main Street. It doesn't change how many pizzas I eat or get baked. It upsets the markets, about whom God does not care, because the markets are frivolous, and what matters are jobs, hopes, dreams, and living standards of average people. And when you talk about inflation, my same point goes through. Inflation, by definition, is a change in the price of goods and services that people on Main Street consume: brownies, coffee, peaches. Average people don't give a hoot about the stock or the bond markets, which you all in your business, and me, are forced to deal with. So the important thing to begin with here is to know that the Fed not only cannot stop or cause business cycles the way it used to for reasons I've detailed for years, but likewise, it has very little control over inflation. To give an example of this, my colleague Alan Blinder at Princeton, head of economics and former vice chairman of the Fed, wrote a Times op-ed piece apologizing for his economist colleagues for telling people that the overspending by Biden caused the huge inflation that we had that went from 2.5 to 9, remember? And then the Fed tightened hugely, and the inflation fell back right down to 2. Now, of course, something had to cause that, so it was the Fed. It had absolutely nothing to do with it, nor any power. The reason for the inflation happened to be the same in 29 other countries where there were no feds. So screw that explanation. The reason was when you can't buy cauliflower, the price doubles. And the COVID shortages, followed by the war shortages and supply chain disruptions, completely caused the inflation and did so everywhere on earth. Excess spending by Biden in 19 and 20 or whoever, it didn't even play into it. Then, of course, the Fed raised rates way up, correct? And inflation came down. And everyone said the Fed had brought down inflation. Did it bring down inflation? By raising rates so high it caused 2 back-to-back recessions, which we haven't even had for years. So the inflation fell right back in every country because once again you could buy cabbages. And when they're available, the price falls in half. Furthermore, if you want to believe that the Fed caused the inflation to go away, you have to realize there's a 2-year lag between the Fed tightens and when the inflation on Main Street goes down. Main Street. Inflation is Main Street. No one cares about asset prices. And unfortunately, this happened within 3 months of when the Fed started tightening. So there's no way that the Fed tightening could have brought down inflation. Other things brought it down. In this case, it was the shortage story. Now, when you ask me about inflation, remember the great statement, probably the best statement Warren Buffett ever made, which is that inflation is to interest rates, which are the variable, what gravity is to mass. Smile. That's a high IQ remark. So if you want to know where the markets are going and where the interest rates are going, you better damn well understand inflation. That is why for years we have worked on that and we are very knowledgeable about inflation. So before I tell you, I gather there's some new people on the screen. Before I say what I think will happen to inflation, I think it's very important to go right back to square one to understand what inflation actually means. It's the change of prices of goods and services on Main Street, period. When does inflation go up? Obviously, when they print more money. So everyone has more dollars with which to buy ice cream, correct? Absolutely wrong. 2 Nobel Prizes later. Inflation, if you think back to your Ec1 days, which most people have had, think of a simple XY axis graph with a supply curve and a demand curve. Remember, they cross. That's where supply equals demand. And the price at which they cross is called the market price today. Inflation is about how the market price today changes. And the mathematical fact, and it's unarguable, and there is no possible alternative, is that prices only change when either the supply location or the supply or demand curve move. Repeat, move. Repeat, the curve moves. The supply curve. There's no such thing as supply and demand. It's a functional relationship. It's the curve of your textbook. So if one moves out, and there's more demand for ice cream because the Fed's dropped $1 billion from a helicopter and Woody Brock has more money, I will then buy more ice cream with more money, correct? And that will drive up the price of ice cream and cause inflation. Now people will say, Woody, this is certainly undeniably true, but is a shortcut. Isn't it enough to say that M2 or M6, the money supply, as the Fed drives that way up, which it did in the 2010 to 2020 era, surely with 9% growth in the money supply, inflation is going to explode because everybody has more money. Well, it went down, not up. Repeat, during the period of the highest money printing we've seen with QE, the inflation rate did not go up, it went down. The reason is very simple. Same as in Japan in the early 90s. The way it works is that the money is created in the form of QE, bank reserves. That is, the Fed buys in bad loans and bad securities from the banks to keep them solvent and pays them with cash, known as bank reserves. The size of the bank reserves you have determines how much you can loan to Woody Brock on Main Street. So if there's more reserves available, more loans can be legally made. I can borrow more swimming pools, someone else can, and the price of swimming pools goes up because the demand curve goes out because everyone can now build their swimming pool sooner than they thought. What happened in Japan and America in those decades was that nobody wanted a damn loan. They'd been through a shock. They didn't borrow, and their debt actually got paid down. So the fact that money had been printed and gone into the hands of the banks in the form of reserves did not do anything to inflation, because the reserves were not lent out to Woody Brock, who never built that swimming pool, and the prices of swimming pools didn't go up. So again, shortcuts like just watch a quantitative number, like the changes in M2, that will tell you very, very little. Having said this, the great mistake that most people make in assessing inflation, including most all of the Fed governors whom I know, is they don't understand the point that our first Nobel, Paul Samuelson, made. Only shifts in the location of the supply and the demand curve called prices to go up or down. Only. Since Keynes, the problem with macroeconomics has been, Keynes said we can't do anything to move the supply curve, but we can give people money and borrow and run deficits, moving the demand curve around. So we called it demand management. That's what it was called when I was at Harvard the freshman year. And this used to be true. But the problem is, with the rise of the digital revolution and the fact that as in 1900, the revolution caused the cost of making things to go way down. Just think of the disinflation caused by Zoom. When you have a technological revolution, and we had one starting in 1980 for 40 years and still going on, it becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper for John Deere to make tractors. And the price does what? When it's cheaper to make something, with competition, the price keeps falling. So technology has played the fundamental role, not the Fed, in keeping a lid on inflation, and that will continue. And these are not vague statements by Woody Brock. These are deep theorems in economics. You can't argue against what I just said. So, in the past 20 years, 30 years, 41 since Volcker saw 15% inflation in my country and raised rates to 20, and as you said, busted inflation. He didn't bring down inflation. He raised rates so high it caused everyone to be fired, big recessions, less buying power, so no one could afford ice cream, and inflation fell because of the impact of his very high rates on investment spending in the economy. New plants were canceled, new steel plants. In today's services economy, 44 years later, there are no plants anymore. A plant means you add a garage to Bill Gates's garage. We are now a consumer economy. 82% of GDP is services, waiters, government workers, lawyers, Woody Brocks, this, that, the other thing. We do not care about the Fed funds rate at all. It is the markets that do. But you remember, you are asking me about what will the economy do. So I'm trying to make clear. Inflation is at the rate it was at on average for 100 years. People say, when are we going back to the new normal of 1%? Or when will the Fed funds rate be zero again? It never was. The whole thing's been wacky for 20 years, and we've lost sight of the whole thing. We are at the average of everything right this minute, and we are doing very well. There's absolutely no need for the Fed, other than the games it plays with the markets, to raise or lower rates whatsoever. It doesn't matter. Contrarily, Woody, are you saying interest rates don't matter? To the contrary, our economy, the opposite of Australia, is all about mortgages and borrowing long. Repeat, 10-year rates, 30-year rates. Home sales collapse, correct? If interest rates go up to 20 from 10%. Yes? So, now we have an interesting story. Who sets long-term rates? The Fed can only control the overnight rate of money. And the answer is my mother. Don't ever forget, the bonds the Treasury issues, the bonds General Electric issues, are bought by Jacob Rothschild in London, my mother, and the IBM Pension Fund. And the minute they see Washington misbehaving, it could be because of what Trump will do, or it could be because we're not dealing with our debt problem and we're just going broke. Finally, the foreign investors and the other people like my mother say, we'll Mr. Government, we'll go on funding your deficits. We want a 3% risk premium. Now we want a 6% risk premium. In Greece, it went to a 90% risk premium. So we determine what long-term rates will be by the law of supply and demand applied to the bond market. And the Fed can't do anything about the long rate, but that is what determines housing levels and all sorts of things. So this is just a brief review. Now, when you look at inflation in the last 30 years, as you know, it went down very nicely. Labor costs dropped. So once again, we've been through this wonderful period of disinflation, right through to 2021. And I've given you the 3 reasons why. It took inflation way down to 2%. Then we had the COVID story and the shortages, and inflation went way up and came way down. I've already talked about that. Looking ahead, the reasons why, and I always stress causality, inflation went down are reversing. Wages are going up, unions are forming again, Chinese workers are not allowed to make things. Labor will push up the inflation rate. B, government deficits in my country average 1% of GDP for 50 years. Last year, the markets, especially the bond market, sold off when it turned out that in peacetime with full employment, our deficit was 7% of GDP. This is scandalous and unprecedented. Scandalous. This is going to grow. There's absolutely no more ability to control spending after what Biden has done, and the American taxpayer will neither be taxed to pay for these new benefits everyone gets, nor will they stand the benefits being cut back. As Bill Clinton said, the welfare state is a contradiction. We're spoiled, rotten, middle-class people, demand more and more child care and benefits, and won't pay for any of it. So the solution is very simple. Screw the children through the wall. Leave them with staggering debt unheard of to service every year and lower standards of living. That's what we've done. So when you look at inflation, quantum computing, AI, other stuff, I think technology will continue to keep somewhat of a lid on it. Mathematically, what I'm saying is it will continue to push the supply curve outward, which when that happens, prices go down. But the labor markets will be more inflationary. The fact that no one has children will make this much worse over time, as the old people refuse to die and there's no one to mow my lawn. There are no children. This is a huge change in the whole Western world. And finally, government deficits and excess spending by government who refuses to tax people to pay for it, just as they did in the Vietnam War. It caused inflation to triple. That can happen. I see inflation right now sort of moving away from its 40-year trend down for the 3 reasons I gave you, to moving back up. But the technological revolution will keep a lid on it by offsetting things like higher wages, as will robots that can replace people. Okay, so we see the Fed for now keeping rates about the way they are. We see inflation being, we never thought it would end up at 2. We always said 3, 3.5, and that's just what's happening. And it could go up over time in this country. The bull market of the last 43 years since 81, when the Dow or the other index went from 850 to 42,000, is explainable only by 2 reasons, and a bubble is not one of them. First, markets do well when interest rates drop. In that period, rates went from 16 to 1%, okay, the biggest drop in history. That's been great for the long-term stock market. Number 2, my friend Mordecai Kurtz's book at Stanford that I've talked about a lot in my papers. You had monopoly profits with Amazon and Microsoft and these people 10 times greater than ever before in history. Staggering increase in profits. The market likes that, correct? So between huge growth of profits, as we walked away completely with this 3rd or 4th industrial revolution, combined with the biggest drop of interest rates in history, meant that the markets did brilliantly without a bubble. Now, certain tech companies, of course, have bubbles. But when you get into something like Amazon, which I wouldn't buy because the PE was 60, well, I lost my shirt. It should have been 150. I had no idea it would conquer the world. So that's the end of the answer to your question. We see long-term rates slowly going up. The world becomes impatient with our misbehavior and refusal to deal with our debt, which is huge. We see labor getting a bigger share. We see the share going to capital as opposed to labor going back down to where it normally used to be. And so the great drop in inflation causing the great drop in interest rates, which partly caused the great rise in the markets, is over for 50 years. You won't see it again. This means active management will be the main way that people can try to, quote, beat the market. Well, I just index in the last 40 years because I don't invest strategically. And indexing took the market from 80 in 1981 to 42,000. So those are better returns from indexing than anybody could have conceived or dreamed of. Unlike the 20-year period before that of the OPEC and Vietnam War and OPEC prices, when my father, in 20 years of retirement, lost half his money in the index. Repeat, lost half his money. Mine went up 20-fold. So this hopefully will put in perspective to you all the whole story of inflation affecting interest rates, affecting the markets. Now, what I have not done, and will not do so because we have the Trump thing to discuss, is to point out that whereas I have said the Fed doesn't have the power anymore by changing the short-term rate that the market's so obsessed with, because it doesn't do anything to Main Street. The Fed is aware of this. They don't talk about it. So because of this, Fed policy is radically changed. And the new tool for controlling the economy by the Fed is not the Fed funds rate. It was the 2014 interest reserve remuneration rate, whereby the bank reserves that banks hold and make loans to Woody Brock to stimulate the economy. The Fed can say in October, the economy is pretty hot. We want to slow it down. Banks, we don't want you to loan so much. So we will pay you 3% on all your reserves. If you sit on your reserves, swivel in your chairs, and don't make loans. Or if things are too slow and we need to stimulate, now the Fed can say, we will pay you 4% on your reserves if you get out of your chair and go make loans to every Woody Brock around. Repeat, this is the interest rate bank reserve remuneration rate. It's not something a lot of people read about. That's the new tool of the Fed, along with QE. Both were unthought of in the year 2009. The global financial crisis forced the central banks of the world to adopt completely new policies to control matters because the wimp Fed funds rate wasn't mattering. Now, we've written you all about this since before it even happened. We saw it, we documented it. So that's the end for inflation as I see it. I think it will rise. I think it's right now rising back up a little bit. But for now, we're okay. And a lot of the money that will be driving up the deficit, all the trillions appropriated for infrastructure by Biden. Well, the good news is none of it's gotten spent to cause inflation because it takes 20 years to get permits to put a fire escape on a building with our completely ineffective system. Let me stop, and then we can move on to Trump. So please, disagreements, because I've said a lot of things, questions. The more disagreements, the better. So please feel free, everyone, to ask.
Hey, anybody, you want to open up your mic and ask a question?
Sure, I'll ask a question. It's Chris Dutton here.
Thanks.
So what you mentioned that you don't think the Fed raising interest rates has an impact on the economy. I would argue that it does, that it actually really has a big negative impact on the lower end of the economy. People that need to borrow for car leases, it really impacts small businesses with their lines of credit. And that's maybe what I think happens is that the economy might sort of separate. The rich do well, they get higher interest rate payments, but the low income people that are renters that don't own a house can really suffer when short-term interest rates rise, which maybe explains why Trump was reelected. Does that make any sense? Like how the short-term rate rising, actually, the overall economy may do well because of the high end, but the low end consumer can really suffer.
The point you're making is absolutely correct. I'm not saying there's no impact, but I'm saying it's less because the options open to how much interest rates they actually pay after the Fed makes its move is much more flexible and broad than ever before. Do not forget the bank interest rates of Bank of America and the other members of the Federal Reserve System now only make little Woody Brock 35% of the loans. The rest of them are made by Henry Kravis and private equity. It's a huge change going on. The banking system is just transforming, and they can make it possible for me to get through a short-term recession. To see this, notice, and again, this is something, David, I have stressed to you for years. Notice how everybody thinks after the Fed raised rates, the small people are going to get hurt. Consumers are overdone. They have to pay higher interest rates on their loans. All the things you're saying, which are partly true. And that the consumer will lead us into recession because the consumer is, quote, exhausted. There are 48 other adjectives. Guess what you have read as headlines in the papers 40 times in 3 years? The surprise is the economy did well because the consumption was strong. You see what I'm getting at? So you're partly right, and there will be people hurt. But the ways of getting around it and going on spending consumption, and I don't mean by the rich, are pretty impressive. All I'm saying is that overall, the impact of the funds rate per se is much less than it used to be, which the Fed has basically admitted, having to introduce both QE and the reserve rate remuneration. That's my best answer, but you're certainly partly correct.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with what you're saying.
So
that
that's
makes sense. Yeah.
Others. The more the disagreements, the better. If you don't ask me and don't disagree, I'll play the terrible trick of asking you to answer mathematical questions. And then we'll see people rushing out of the room. Okay, so what else? Anything else? These are big topics. I've had to go fast.
Well, here's a Trump question that was part of your 4-1s. Woody's thoughts on how deep tariffs will be in the Trump presidency and its impact on global trade.
I'm sorry, how deep terrorists will be in the
tariffs will be TARIS.
Yes, we're coming to that in one second. Okay. So is it all right if we just move on to the whole Trump thing? Because this involves World War III and it involves the correct question that you just answered, that you just asked. I'm writing a memo, you'll get it next week, on this whole, what is the meaning of the Trump thing? And I think it's very important to divide your thoughts 2 different ways. First, what will the Trump victory mean for domestic policy and for the domestic economy in America? Second, and really quite a different thing, is what happens having Trump when you're on the process, per the Nobel Prize of Reinhard Selten, the probability of world war is going from 2 to 9%. I have also written about it. So these are really very different topics. My personal fear is that Trump is really terrible to be in charge when we need the global alliance like we needed NATO 70 years ago to stop the thugs from beating us up as we morph into, well, we morph from a series of regional wars like the Philippines and China, Russia, the Middle East, into a global version of that when things get very risky. That's quite separate from what most people are talking about. So let me just start off talking about the basic domestic story. When Vice President Harris took up the nomination, she very wisely followed the advice of my friend, former President Clinton, who told her, and he is the high IQ president since Roosevelt, period. He told her, do not forget that to win the country, you have to know that 3/4 of Americans are middle of the road and centrist and non-ideological. They don't want to hear this crap about trisexuality. They don't want to be reading about women and men's sports. They're basic. They want the potholes to go, the test scores in schools to go up, and inflation to stay moderate. Okay? She did that. She had been, until then, somebody with nothing but progressives behind her. She then reached out to the center. Now she lost, but it helped a lot that she abandoned these, frankly, somewhat loony woke policies and became more centrist. And she said it worked. Trump had a chance to tell the world that he was going to abandon his craziness and reach out and try to unify by picking cabinet members that were competent, rational, and that represented different points of view, not just right wing. Whereas she did a good job, he failed totally and has appointed complete whack jobs that are regionally incompetent. I mean, Robert Kennedy is a complete idiot who knows anything, and he's against viruses, virus vaccines. I could go on and on. And the idea of putting a convicted criminal in as attorney general, every appointment has been an offense and a shove in the face of people who like normal, moderate policies like me and like most Americans. So he's failed in that regard. Now, what damage could he do? He can make life hell for all the bureaucrats that are in the administrative departments, the State Department, Commerce, They can make your life. People quit. You won't be able to get passports. It'll take another year to get a passport. And all kinds of stuff can happen. And probably will. But can he push through his signature policies? As you asked, high tariffs, deporting 11 million people. And what was the third one? Tax cuts. Okay. Note here the irony. The irony, he was elected because of the dislike of the American people of one variable more than any other. Inflation. The very policies he's pursuing are inflationary by definition. So there'll be a huge problem here. He won't be able to do what he said without causing the inflation that will get the next Congress 23 months from now voted out, replaced with all Democrats. He will have been seen to be a fraud. So his objective of being the low inflation president will have been torpedoed by his own wacky tariffs alone in 4 different ways cause inflation and lower productivity. They're idiotic. The basic economic theory says if people trade fair, then no tariffs is far the best for everybody. So if we're very good at making watermelons and you're very good at making broccoli, then we sell you the one and you sell us the other, and the currency hits a level where supply equals demand between the two countries, and everything is in balance. We sell what we're good at doing and they sell what they're good at doing. Regrettably, the world is not a world of fair trade. And China's used every dirty trick possible to basically use slave labor to undercut American labor, sold us far more of their stuff at chisel prices than we ever sold them, giving us a huge bilateral trade deficit. When a country doesn't play fair, then there are justifications for high tariffs, but only then. The notion of putting 30% tariffs on everything will backfire badly because it will cause inflation. Worse than inflation, it will cause those very irritating shortages which prevent you getting anything on time, and all of this is common sense. So the fundamental contradiction is he wants policies that will cause the inflation, which will get his troops thrown out of office in 2 years and in 4, and he'll be lame duck. Now let me stop. That's an important point you don't hear a lot. So disagreements.
Yeah, I'll disagree, Woody. I think these are all talking points of the left, of the media of the left, which is the majority of the media. I think when you start listening to more podcasts, which tend to be more right-leaning, and they're not just like one person speaking to 20 people like us today, you're getting like hundreds of thousands of people's opinions built in there, like Joe Rogan, etc. And then, of course, the Fox News, which we all know is very right-leaning. They try to be somewhat centrist. I would disagree with some of your statements. Everybody goes to an extreme when they talk about Donald Trump because he was so extreme his first term. He didn't know what he was doing in his first term. He's had some of his minions explain that to the media. He was totally out of his element. It's a good thing that he had 4 years off because he would have been a total lame duck president for that second term. Now he comes in, he's surrounding himself with, in my opinion, appear to be, for the most part, intelligent people. I've heard the whole thing about RFK, so the proof will be in the pudding with him. I can't say anything more about that. But in terms of these tariffs, he would be asinine to put them across the entire economy. He'll be very selective, and on selective countries too. and try to turn it into a form of revenue, a real revenue channel. But back in the 1880s, the 1890s, there wasn't even income tax invented yet. That wasn't until the 90s. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. America was very, very wealthy then, living off of tariffs. Now, that was a very different time, of course. You know, this is a global economy now. Things move more rapidly. But I think if he's selective about tariffs and uses them more as a, to get our trade deficit, which has been negative since the 1970s, this country, your country can't go on anymore with negative trade deficits for another decade, because it will run against a wall. So anyways, that's my pushback, and maybe it's showing my political stripes. But I think we gotta look at all forms of media, and most of the mainstream media don't even listen to it anymore because it's nonsense. It's all propaganda for the most part.
Well, we obviously disagree, and I happen to think there is such a thing as truth about the impact of tariffs. It's well accepted. It gets Nobel Prizes, and it's not propaganda at all. And furthermore, to put criminals in charge of the Defense Department, the Attorney General, the selections have been by and large terrible. Let me repeat, it's not politics at all, and it has zero to do with podcasts and the media. It is the fact that the people are by definition and by background incompetent completely to do the jobs they're being given. That is my problem. I don't mind the media, and I'm aware that podcasts and Joe Rogan, get a lot of attention today. I don't find them left wing or right wing. I find them, some of them open, whatever. But the real story here is what policies will he get through? And you're saying that for the reasons I agree with, he won't be able to do a lot with tariffs. But he's run on that, saying every tariff is wonderful. Now, you and I know politics. Other things, to have somebody say I don't believe in vaccines in charge of HEW. I was young, right here in this house, when the polio assault came in 51.
Right.
I think I was 5. And we couldn't go to the beach or to the movies. Dr. Salk invented a vaccine. It was tested, it worked, everyone took it, and everyone stopped dying. We now have 3 new vaccines in the world that could morph, and we better be ready, to deal with it. To say vaccines are wrong is absurd. So,
but once again, let's sort of interrupt, but once again, that's the media saying that he's saying that all vaccines, and he's not saying that. He's saying certain ones.
The person he has picked for that department has said basically that. So it's a matter, to me, it's not a matter of left wing, right wing, or the crap you hear on podcasts or on Fox News or in anywhere, New York Times. I want competence from the people he appoints. And I know no intelligent people who thinks he's made good appointments. There is one waiting in the wings. He's my friend and a client for 30 years, Scott Bessent. Listen to him this morning. He is a really good, smart economist who's been up #1 for the Secretary of Treasury. But Musk thinks he has the wrong attitude and will maybe torpedo. But there you have someone who is very good, and I hope Trump appoints him. So I somewhat agree with you. But I think the press thing isn't only the issue here. It's basically, since he's so stubborn, can he and his hand-picked colleagues tone it down a lot, not to cause the damage that could get him diselected? So we don't disagree that much, but I certainly want the most competent person in each of these fields. That's as far as I'll say. And I do not believe the people he's picked are. However, there is.
But let's just go on to just government waste and government. I've never heard of a party in my years of following politics that's truly, other than Reagan maybe, cutting back on government. And so I welcome this idea that they're going to go and take a look at it. And so the government growth of employment has been the highest out of any other industry. And
this
that can't
is
go on.
Absolutely true, and I agree with you. However, once again, we have tried. It's very hard to achieve. No country has, France, England, Germany, slowing down the growth of government as more and more people become dependent on handouts is really tough. I agree with you. And I liked it when Trump came in and started slashing all those regulations. I thought that was great, but it's going to be a hard thing to do. Now, let me just make the second point about the domestic situation. There's more to this election than Trump. It was this extraordinary widening of the Republican band across races, sexes, interest rate, different things, and essentially separate entirely to what they may think about Trump and his character. What has happened is essentially the country has spoken, and the country, not the politicians, were very silent about this. But they voted their disgust at the elites who mismanaged this country for 50 years. The plumber who said, I am sick of being taxed at 40% marginal rates to fund a $1,000 grant for somebody at Harvard who's majoring in lesbian grievance theory 102. People are fed up with wokeism, fed up with the whole thing, and their vote is showing that. That was something that pleased me a great deal, because I think the universities have been absolutely outrageous and culpable. Read, if you want the good article, the only good article, read this month's cover story of the Atlantic Monthly by the New York Times commentator, Bill, what is his name? Oh, it'll come to me. It's called How the Ivy League Ruined Democracy. We went from an aristocracy of sorts into a new world after the war, in which all that mattered now is where did you get your degree and what is your board score? You could quantify these things. We ended up, everyone is appointed because of their background. They're this. Just listen to the appointments where people went to school and stuff. Winston Churchill did not win against all odds World War II by picking generals that had high board scores. He picked by having people with real character, a word you're not allowed to use anymore because it's called subjection, when it's the only thing in life that really matters. So I think that this is the beginning of a swing back. And I saw it with the Carter years, when there were all these student demonstrations, war drafters fleeing to Canada, we all thought that things had really gone to hell. In came Reagan, and young men were wearing neckties by 1984. It was pretty amazing to see it. I think we're swinging culturally. And that has nothing to do with his appointments or anything else. Furthermore, by extension, you get the same thing in Germany, France, and England, whose governments are incidentally a mess, even if they don't have a Trump. So I think that this is the other dimension of this vote that's very important, and I hope so.
Yeah. Well, there's a vetting period going on, obviously for him, obviously for his appointments. They're not all going to get pushed through or voted on or whatever. So there's definitely going to, and the system should take care of itself on that.
I hope.
So we all hope that.
But you know, when he's using the Senate and procedural to have them not have to confirm people, that's just another thing.
That's wrong.
No, that's all right. He's going to try. It's his right. I don't think he'll succeed, but let me, so I don't bore you, move to the international dimension of all of this. What's going on in the world is much bigger than anything about Trump. What's going on is what was described as the reason why the nations going to war becomes much more probable by a man with whom I co-edited a book, Reinhard Selten, who got the Nobel Prize with my teacher, John Nash, who invented game theory. Okay, we're not talking about smart people. We're talking about conceptual geniuses whose thinking has transformed the world of their disciplines completely. Okay. He wrote a paper called In a World Where Two is Few and Five is Many. He answered the question, which was the deepest question of international relations. Why did World War I happen? Nobody wanted it. Not the Germans. Wilhelm was a wimp. And what he showed was that when you have a situation of America and Russia facing each other off at n equals two players, they stare at each other, they know everything about each other, there are no alliances they have to answer to or anything, and they don't, with much probability, go to war. But when you have the beginning of World War I, you have five major players, the empires of Austro-Hungary, France, England, Russia, and Prussia. Then, you know the old story about how many ways you can seat 10 people at a dinner table. I mean, it's something like 100 million. Once you have Austro-Hungary be able to switch sides from Russia to join with England and the whole thing's become very, very confusing. And it's very easy when some event happens, which then was the assassination of the Archduke of Austria in Serbia in 1913. Different empires were unclear on what their obligations were to their allies, and people ended up rationally, given their misunderstandings, doing things that led to a war no one wanted, and that once started couldn't be stopped. And the fear today I have, and it's his logic, is that we move from more isolated regional incidents that don't affect the stock market at all. The announcement that China wants to take over the Philippines and in 2 years Taiwan, the markets don't even notice. They're used to that. And they're used to the Middle East being trouble. And there's Putin over there. And the markets don't respond. They just marches to 42,000. Unfortunately, an event happened like Serbia 3 weeks ago, where Iran and Israel, the two main powers, bomb each other outright without the use of surrogates. This is very, very frightening because they each are backed by Russia, China, and the US. And so the whole thing becomes less regional and a more of a global risk. Now, in a world like this, and it is very high risk, I mean, just look at the ambition of the Russians and the Chinese. In such a world, there's only one way for us to defend ourselves. And I wrote about that also. And so I'll just summarize it very briefly. When Russia came in and had been our partner in World War II and took over, and after the war, it went into Eastern Europe and seized 14 countries and brutally communized them. Instantly, Winston Churchill and President Truman said, 1947, we've got to join together, all of us, and form NATO, which was a military alliance with the power that if they did anything like taking 1 acre of Latvia, they would, every troop involved would be killed, disappear, and they'd have the power of the US behind it, which in 1947 was by a factor of some 10, the richest, most powerful country in the history of the world. Because we had not only the great economy, we alone had the H-bomb. So we formed an alliance that worked, and Russia has never taken an acre outside. We now need to extend NATO to include Australia, Japan, Singapore, 38 countries in all of whom act exactly as NATO requires. We have a rotating commander-in-chief. We lay down red laws. If in Iran seizes a Swedish boat in the middle of international waters, there will not be a phone call. The boat that seized it will evaporate for the death ray. And everybody will know this. It's the old walk softly but carry a big stick, Roosevelt's famous comment. So we need a major alliance. And if we have it, incidentally, if you just take Australia and Tasmania, there are more rare earth metals that Russia can use to bribe us, more oil than the rest of the world, the phlegocracies have. We would be with a net worth of 30 times that of the rest of the world, and we would never be able to be blackmailed. So we don't go to war with anyone. We just don't deal with these people and tell them if they do cross the red line, bing will happen. Now, my worry, personally, is Trump will be a terrible person to build the alliance. That he'll get frustrated and tell Germany to basically, it's my way or the highway. In Germany, they'll say, fine, it's the highway. It's very delicate to do what Churchill and Roosevelt did. And they did it, it succeeded, and it worked. For me, the Trump story, to everything else, forgetting everything else, for it to be happening now, when the probability of war, is rising sharply, and his nature and his behavior, I think, will make it very difficult to get the alliance I would like to see. That makes me worried. I'm worried for myself personally.
You didn't mention about North Korea lending soldiers to Russia.
Oh my God, that's just one example. The whole thing's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, what the Chinese are doing to our ally, the Philippines, and we've been so wimpy about foreign policy. No one believes we'll come to the rescue. Yeah. I mean, to think 2 Sundays ago, I woke up. The front page New York Times headline said 6 Iranians admit having been paid Iranians to assassinate our president. You know, Ronald Reagan would have said, fine, the cost to you of that, 5 of your military bases within 20 minutes. Not a word was made by the government. Not a word was said about this being bad. So people just think we're a pushover. And one good thing about Trump is he won't be pushed over. But we need an alliance to avoid being pushed over. That's just Woody Brock's
in his first 4 years, there was really very little war going on. Now that was maybe just good luck and good timing. Who knows?
You're absolutely right. What I said was for him this time around, at this point, when you do have this exploding probability of war, you can't be certain. We really need to go very, very carefully in who we offend and what we do. That's all. 5, 6, 7 years ago, these were not the issues, and there was no Crimea. So anyway,
because Biden could have lent these warheads ages ago to the Ukraine. So maybe it's just more dirty politics now on his way out to make life very difficult. But one podcast I listened to say, it's when things get their worst that things can get solved, and maybe that's what's also being forced here.
There is that hope, but I'm just worried about this concept, radical concept, known in the textbooks as a mistakes equilibrium, where people act rationally on false information, which is very easy to have in a time of
nowadays
crisis.
Especially.
Yeah. And it worries me because he showed how serious that is. Anyway, I have been boring for long enough. Other disagreements, questions from any of you about this or other topics? The economy, I haven't written about because you know my view. We said there wouldn't be a recession. We're marching along at 3%. Everyone said the consumer is overextended and dead. And you've seen the headline every time, the consumer is fine. Now, I'm not saying that will always go on, but part of my theory of the new business cycle is that the old business cycle caused by huge inventory swings when Ford would cancel production of cars and U.S. Steel would stop production and 1 million people would be laid off with lousy benefits. You better believe that hurt and cause recessions. But today it'll be some exogenous thing like the housing shock when all these people borrowed with no income and no assets, or a COVID. We call them exogenous, meaning outside shocks. These will continue to bang us and hit us. And that is why the Feds of the world after 2010 becomes so extremely ready to buffer people from shocks, whether it's running huge deficits to keep them happening or doing crazy things to interest rates. It's a real change.
So what about with Trump potentially controlling both the House and the Senate and, of course, the Supreme Court? What about the debt ceiling? Like, is the debt ceiling just going to be another joke that will just get lifted yet again?
There is no debt ceiling. They'll raise it forever. Because if you don't, you have to do things to get it, as Clinton said, get you voted out of office, not next election, but the next morning. You have to tamper with Social Security, and the democratic system won't allow pain to the consumer. So they'll have to raise the debt ceiling. It's rising at 30 trillion a year or something. I don't know. It's crazy. But so far, as you point out, the world has been prepared to buy our paper. We are considered safe. That's why the dollar is high. And people buy not government bonds, foreigners with this huge 15 trillion savings glut due to thugs around the world stealing 13% of GDP of the third world. I mean, what happens is just, my train of thought got lost, but they look at us as the most likely place to put their money for their grandchildren.
Yeah.
So all this money comes into the Cayman Islands and 20 minutes later, it's invested in America. But you can't buy American assets unless you buy what first? The dollar. So the demand for the dollar is much higher than it should be, especially given your point about our trade deficit. So trade deficits used to determine the value of the currency. Now they don't even matter. Everything's changed, We've had a pretty...
Sorry, I hate going on a bit about Trump again, but back in 2016 when he was running and not knowing what he was doing, but he was just, taking advantage of the media, and people were ticked off back then and wanted change. But one thing he kept saying over and over is the Chinese were manipulating their currency down. Why can't the U.S. dollar be somehow manipulated down? Well, surprise, surprise. You see, in 2017 when he was in power, I forgot the numbers. I think it went from like 105 down to like 83, so significantly down. Do you think that could happen again, or how is he able to do that,
And you're using the word he. The problem with what you're
or
saying
the
is
system
the
that he was in
system
charge of?
of global, no, it's the thing to forget about, to never forget about currencies, as I've told you, is there is no dollar.
Mhm.
The word has no meaning. It's only defined binarily as dollar yen, dollar this, dollar Deutschmark. And so the notion that the American he can somehow manipulate the dollar, those efforts usually fail. And the currencies rise and fall for good fundamental reasons, like they have higher interest rates to attract investment, or a country goes to hell and they want a high risk premium. So there's not much power. It's what I was saying about the long-term interest rate. There's no magic wand where you can say it's too high, let's drop it 10%. The only thing where you can do that is the Fed funds rate, the overnight rate for money. All right. Any last thing?
Yeah, Woody, do you have a view as to Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies? There's rumor that Gary Gensler, the current chair of the SEC, is going to be stepping down before Thanksgiving. And I'm just wondering, with the run up in Bitcoin and Ether and some of the other applications, do you still have a view as to cryptocurrencies?
I have a strong view. I don't know what the hell they are. I've never found anyone that can explain why we need them. I can't pay for dinner tonight with them. They have a tendency to go up, as you're saying, and we forget. Do you know how much Bitcoin's dropped 6 times?
Yeah.
So here is the only point I'll make that's interesting. A currency, to be a currency, has to have 2 properties. A, you have to be able to use it to transact. Now, you can pay for a $50 million Van Gogh with cryptocurrency, but you can't pay for dinner yet in the restaurant. But the second property currency must have is the people living in a country hold that currency and retire on it. Retire. Suppose I put all my money into crypto, and then the day I come to retire, my dollar value of crypto falls in half because crypto falls 50%. That's the problem. The problem is it doesn't have the property of stability that a currency has to be a store of value. Now, I'm not saying anything's perfect when it comes to stability, but that is a problem, particularly because it happens to be an asset prone to speculative bubbles, correct? The
Right.
dollar isn't. The dollar is a big fat bore, but at least I know I won't have to eat cat food souffle if the dollar. So my answer is it's a fascinating thing. It's a huge industry, crypto. But for years we've been told how we had to have it. But as some very good article reason put it, the reasons aren't that persuasive. Will it replace the dollar? Absolutely no way. And the reason is the same as the reason that people get wrong when they wonder why the dollar has 58% of the world currency reserves, correct? Now, we were 53% of GDP of the world after the war. So you could understand the US was the reserve currency of other governments by choice. Now people say, look at China, it's about as big as we are. Why shouldn't there be, 30% there and 30% in America? The reason's very important to understand. Reserve currencies and where central bankers put their money is determined by middle-class, risk-averse bureaucrats who want to cover their butt and play it safe, okay? They buy Switzerland and America because they know that whatever happens, quote, they'll still be around. China, its record, its currency manipulation, as you spoke of it, China, people don't trust at all.
No.
So China has something like 1.9% of world reserve currencies, and we're still up there at 52, even though as a share of GDP, we've dropped from 53 to 18 for the world. So, it's just like to take another statistic. The innovation level of the United States which we thought in 2000 with the dot-com collapse was sort of over. But in the last 20 years, these 11 companies, Amazon, whatever, have been created. And you've probably seen this number. 11 American stocks at market values, greater than the sum of the entire stock markets of Japan, Germany, and England. This has never happened in history. So my point then is people are going to continue, I think, to put money into America, not because it's great, but as Dick Cooper taught me at Harvard, when you talk about a currency, you're talking about picking the least rotten apple in the barrel.
Yeah, that's great, Woody. I think final statement or comment, and you can reply, is when you see people like Warren Buffett, who's got roughly a third of his portfolio in short-term treasuries now for Berkshire
Yes.
Hathaway. They talk about 325 billion in cash. Well, it's $1 trillion business now, so roughly a third is in cash. He's preparing for a storm. No one knows the timing of things, but do you have any expectations of when what could trigger and cause him to have that buying power going to work?
First of all, the question, Woody, what do you think could go wrong that would justify what he's done? And my main worry would be some kind of an expansion of war, causing shortages and problems for the economy. That would be my worry. In his case, he has the age and the long run perspective, as I tried to write for you all for years, that the stock market, the average, went from 870 in 1981 to 42,000. Anyone older who's seen this, he can remember that my father lost half his money in the terrible performance of the market between 65 and 82. Okay? So he realizes he's lived through an astounding period. He never dreamed he'd have this money. And he knows the world is run by people who are idiots and that war is possible. And I think he's just playing it safe. Good for him. He didn't take everything out, but he took a lot. But many times people have kept a third of their money. My sister does it in, quote, cash. So, but do I think he knows something I don't know? But what in the future is going to bring us down? I do not believe he knows that. I believe no one knows that. It will be a, quote, mistakes equilibrium type of thing that catches us off guard, and things then start happening so fast we don't even know how to respond.
I like that. A mistakes equilibrium.
That was the Nobel Prize for Selton, this man. Yeah. He said the alliances, the multi-parties, the confusion, the misunderstandings, and people do things that cause a war that nobody wanted. That's a deep thought. Because we like to say rational people would never go to war. Quite to the contrary.
Yeah. Okay, Woody, thanks a lot for your time, and great as always. Thanks a lot for this, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you.